It's the afternoon of December 10th, 2008. I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. We're on the campus of Rutgers University at the Eagleton Institute of Politics for the Rutgers program on the governor, specifically the Brendan T. Byrne Archive. This afternoon we're going to talk to Gordon MacInnes. Gordon was an assemblyman at the beginning of the Byrne years. He became the executive director of New Jersey Network, the public television system, during the Byrne years. He subsequently was a state senator, an assistant commissioner of education, focusing on the Abbott schools. He's currently connected with the Century Foundation and has just put a book together on education policy, and he teaches education policy at his alma mater, or one of his alma maters, the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Gordon, we want to talk to you mainly about Brendan Byrne, but we understand from your bio that you worked for Governor Hughes.
Yes, I did.
What'd you do?
Well, I had two jobs in the Hughes administration. The first was to be the special assistant to the then Commissioner of Education, Carl Marburger, and then to become the special assistant to Dick Hughes himself.
These were full-time jobs after you finished school? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. How were they?
Well, let me say that I enjoyed the second job more than the first. I was pleased to be given the chance to work with Governor Hughes. I learned early that public education can be a frustrating subject, and that people who are characterized as reformers frequently are not absolutely certain about what they intend to do if given the chance. So after 18 months with the commissioner, I moved over to the governor's office.
What'd you do in the governor's office?
Well, that was in the days when the governor's office staff consisted of a speechwriter and sort of administrative assistant, a special assistant, the counsel to the governor with 5 or 6 attorneys, one of whom was full-time on what do you do in extraditions and pardons and things, an executive assistant, and a patronage secretary. So, and
a patronage secretary?
Well, I called the appointment secretary, but their job was to fill the positions that the governor nominates, which, as you know, under the New Jersey Constitution, is quite a few. And and this was in the last 2 years of Dick Hughes' term, and the staff had been reduced somewhat, but not that much. So I had responsibility for the liaison with higher education and education, the Department of Institutions and Agencies, which at that time constituted welfare, mental health, not prisons, a lot of things, Medicaid, agriculture, community affairs, riot planning. There was something else too.
So you got a good broad look at state government.
Yes, I did. Environment was one of the areas that I also had, and where I learned my best lesson from Dick Hughes.
Which was?
This is a complicated subject, but basically the constitutions going back forever have given the state ownership of that land that is flowed by the mean high tide. And it turns out to be a lot of land in New Jersey. And some of it is quite valuable. And the people in Ocean County wanted to say, if anybody's been paying taxes on this land for 20 years and has some title, that they're entitled to ownership. And the Republicans ran the legislature by a 2-to-1 margin, and they put on the ballot a proposed constitutional amendment. And the amendment said basically that what I just said, if you've paid taxes on this and you have some sort of title, you can get ownership. The consequence to the state would have been loss of hundreds of thousands of acres of some very, very valuable land. Much of the Hackensack Meadowlands and all the shore areas, all the estuaries, all the, all the rivers, and so my first job was to look at this and to find out what the consequences would be if this were enacted. And so but to do it quietly, and I did, and it was pretty astonishing. And I came back with my report, and I saw a real master at work who took what was a fairly straightforward and I think pretty clear analysis of the implications of this and understood perfectly how it should be framed and how it should be rolled out. And even
to block the amendment.
To block the amendment. And he did it in such a way that there were even Sunday front page editorials in newspapers that had called on him to resign, the Newark News in that case, saying this is an outrage and Dick Hughes is right, and the Republicans responded by saying it'll be a cold day in hell before we'll ever rescind that concurrent resolution. And Hughes kept it up and had press conferences all over the state, and they came back and rescinded it.
What did you think of Hughes? I mean, you just told us that he had a mastery of what, politics and issues, or
both?
Both. What was your take on Hughes?
Well, I was pretty young. I had not dealt with a lot of politicians. And as I explained, the staff was pretty small. So that in addition to my governmental job, I also did some political work after hours, which included being the research staff director for all of the legislative candidates for the 1969 campaign, and also the liaison with the governor. And so any candidate for the assembly who wanted the governor to appear at a fundraiser would talk to me, and I would get the governor's schedule put together. And as a consequence of that, I spent a lot of time in the back seat of the governor's limousine, because we would get up early on Saturday morning and we would do 12 or 13 events, and then I would be back early Sunday morning. We'd do another 10 or 12 events. He was tireless in his efforts in behalf of Bob Minor, the candidate for governor, and Democratic legislative candidates. And so we talked a lot, and I thought to myself, my God, politicians are unfairly treated in the press. The view of them is incorrect. These people are widely read. They're very wise. They deal with a lot of fast-paced, conflicting situations where they have to make judgments. They tend to make good judgments. They are literate. They can quote widely from Mark Twain and Woodrow Wilson. These New Jersey politicians are just great. And I expected that my experience would be replicated many times thereafter, and it never was. I never was. I never met a politician for whom I had the same kind of respect as I did Dick Hughes. And he was the most genial person on meeting. He never forgot a name or a face, it seemed to me. I know how he did it because his mnemonic trick for my wife was to remember that she had a partially severed Achilles heel when she was 7 months pregnant with our second kid. And every time I would see him after that, he would always say, "And how's Blair doing? And how's that leg?" But anyway, he was, to people who did not know him well, he was almost a stereotypical Irish politician. Hail fellow, well met, friendly, clap on the back. To many who dealt with him, he was also so genial that it appeared like he was a pushover. And in the end, he had a steel spine and knew exactly what he was trying to get done, had a clear notion of how to get there, and acted on it. And he introduced me to ideas that I thought you take for granted. I mean, I would be in the office when he would call Ray Bateman, who was the president of the Senate, and he'd say, "Ray, Dick Hughes, how you doing? And how's the lovely wife? And how are those kids doing? And by the way, Ray, I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to have to say some things that you may not like about you and your colleagues, and they'll probably be in the paper tomorrow. And here's what I had to say. And I don't want you to take any personal offense, Ray. And it'll be great to see you. Let's get dinner sometime." He was really a remarkably effective politician, and I think he started the process that modernized New Jersey, that turned it from what it had been, a byway, a gray industrial state with a manufacturing base, and I think he started the process of modernizing it, particularly in the area of higher education. If you think about it, there were no community colleges when Dick Hughes became governor. There were 6 state teacher colleges and Rutgers. When he left, there were, 18 county colleges. There were 8 state colleges that all either in the process of converting to becoming liberal arts and more broadly based, or brand new.
Funny, I interviewed Ray Bateman recently.
Yeah.
And he took credit for founding the county college system.
He might have.
And maybe Dick Hughes
just went along.
Called him up and said, "I'm going to let you do this."
I don't know. I don't know enough about that. That happened before I worked for the governor.
Who were the key people around Hughes when you were around Hughes? Who was the closest advisor to Hughes? Do you recall?
Well, he had a lot of people he relied on. And it depended, I think, on the subject. I mean, his political advisor was Bob Burkhart, and to some extent John Kervick, and he had some old Mercer County friends who he turned to.
Was he a Mercer County politician?
Yes, he was, and that's how he became. That's how he got the nomination. Thorne Lord was his law partner. Thorne Lord was this. He's worthy of a separate show. But he was from North Carolina, and a painfully slow-speaking, shy lawyer who became the county chairman of Mercer County Democrats at a time when the Republicans ran the county. And Thorne Lord had a way with dealing with all these brash colleagues of his who ran other Democratic counties. And at the time, Essex, Hudson, Middlesex, Passaic, Union, and Camden made up they're the counties that decided what Democrats did. And Thorne Lord put together a coalition of those chairs to make sure that Dick Hughes was nominated in 1961. And Bob Miner had a different candidate, called all the county chairs, or the main county chairs, to Morven, then the governor's residence, and scheduled a press conference. And apparently at that meeting, Thorne Lord interrupted Governor Miner and said, "Well, we're not going to nominate your candidate. We're going to nominate Dick Hughes." But anyway, he relied on Burkhart and Kervick, I think, for most of his political. Steve Farber was his executive assistant at the time and was his main policy driver and ran the office.
Do you recall who the towering legislators of that time may have been?
Oh, sure. Well, there's some familiar names. Of course, the Republicans ran both houses by the time in Hughes' last 2 years. Bill Ozard, Al Beadleston. Al Beadleston was from Monmouth. Bill Ozard was from Union. This is the first legislature, is that correct? This is the second session of the Senate in which the one senator, one county scheme had been broken up by Baker v. Carr. So you had, on the Republican side, you had Ray Bateman, Bill Ozard, and Al Beadleston, I think, were the primary. Wayne Dumont who he defeated in 1965, was in the Senate. I would say those were the best known of the Republicans. You had Billy Musto and Bill Kelly from Hudson County. You had, I think you still had, the Hudson Inge, Mac Goldman, Giblin, Nick Fernicola, I think, were the four from Essex. Matty Feldman from Bergen was in the Senate at the time. And he stayed on and was a major force on educational issues, even when the Republicans ran things. Anyway, those were the Senate people I remember.
How did you get your first job as special assistant to Marburger?
I was coming out of the Army and by way of Washington, D.C., and one of my classmates from the Woodrow Wilson School, Steve Farber, was in the governor's office, shepherding the area of education, having basically done the mechanics for what was then a pretty dramatic confrontation with the education establishment, which is the breakup of the Department of Education and the creation of the Department of Higher Education with a master plan to modernize higher education in New Jersey. And I think I was interested in coming back to New Jersey. I think I talked to Steve. Isn't that how it works? And Carl Marburger was the commissioner, and I came in and saw him.
Had you been to the Woodrow Wilson School?
Steve Farber and I were classmates at the Woodrow Wilson School.
What did you do when Hughes left office?
I became the first director of the Fund for New Jersey, which at the time was called the Wallace Eljabar Fund. Tells you a little bit about the way circumstances prevail in deciding your life. I was in Hughes' office. He used the small private office. The phone rang. It was John Gibbons, who had been a member of the Lilly Commission on the Newark riots. Was the president of the state bar and is the namesake for Gibbons Law Firm today. He was in the interim a member of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And he called Hughes because his neighbor had this foundation that was that he was the son-in-law, and there were three sisters, and they had been left this estate by his father-in-law, who had been the creator of the Wallace Kiernan Company, and they had decided they needed a full-time director for the first time. And Gibbons thought maybe some of those young staff people around the governor would be interested. And so Hughes said, well, I don't know, John. One of them's sitting here. Let me ask him. So that's how I got the interview.
Do you think if you'd been down the hall and somebody else had been sitting there, your life might have taken a different turn?
I think it might have. What
did you do with the Fund for New Jersey?
I created it as a foundation that was going to shift its interest from the philanthropic interests of three sisters to be a source of funding to support public policy, information, and action in New Jersey.
Where was it housed?
East Orange.
Where did you live at the time?
I moved from Trenton to Mendham in order to shorten the commute.
How long were you there?
At the fund?
Yes.
8 years.
8 years?
Yeah. During which time I took a leave to run for the Assembly and to run for re-election unsuccessfully to the Assembly. But yes, I was there 8 years.
You were involved in New Jersey public policy then during the Cahill
Yes.
4-year period.
Right.
What are your recollections of Governor Cahill?
Well, I thought, first of all, I thought he was a formidable politician. And I thought the campaign he ran against Bob Miner was a textbook case of what everybody should know going into a campaign. And at the time, of course, it wasn't television advertising particularly. He took out a series of full-page newspaper ads. I think it was same day every week, basically going right at Miner's supposed strengths and devastating them. And
do you recall what Miner's supposed strength was?
oh, things like integrity. The man who couldn't be bought. And then they'd go after the fact that he represented the tobacco companies and that kind of thing. And anyway, we set up a series of things through the foundation, that some of which were designed to be neutral about Cahill, some of which were designed to be friendly to anybody who was in the governor's chair. So we set up the Coalition for Fair Broadcasting. And to do that, I started with Cahill. He wouldn't see me, but I talked to Paul Sherwin, his Secretary of State. Would Governor Cahill please be the chair of the New Jersey Coalition for Fair Broadcasting? We want to get our share of coverage from Philadelphia and New York stations. Right now we have nothing. And Cahill wasn't interested. So then I went to Tom Kean, who was the disputed but still the Speaker of the General Assembly. And Tom Kean joined in and was an active participant. I went to Senator Harrison Williams, who agreed to be the other co-chair and also was quite active, not always physically in visiting stations, but he was always willing to make a phone call or take part in it. And then we got the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce. We got higher education. We got the NJEA. We put together a coalition of people who thought that New Jersey would be better if we knew more about what was going on here. And as a consequence of that, the coalition, sued against the licenses, the renewal of licenses of many of the stations in New York and Philadelphia, which led in turn to the establishment of New Jersey-based news stations in the state, some of which are still here, I think. I think the ABC state affiliate in Philadelphia still has a bureau in Trenton. And it also led to the creation of the partnership with Channel 13 on New Jersey Nightly News and the establishment of their studio in Newark. We also set up the Center for Analysis of Public Issues, which lasted for quite a while. And it started by selecting areas that were underreported and analyzing the implications of them and issuing reports that were, 15 to 25 pages. And at the time, releasing them to a fairly vibrant daily press in the State House and elsewhere. They get a lot of attention with real consequence.
Was Dick Leone part of that?
He was the first director of it.
But you set it up through the Fund for New Jersey?
Yes, yeah. John Colasar was the second. Tom O'Neill, I think, was the third director of it. And yes.
Back to Cahill for a second. How did his style differ from that of Hughes?
He was I think he was a bit more formal, but Hughes could also be formal. I mean, he, in terms of the way he spoke with people. But I think he was a bit more formal than Hughes was. His style.
You described Hughes as having the touch, the common touch and the smart touch. Was Cahill comparable?
I think he was a friendly person. He was an affable person. I don't think he matched Dick Hughes for his abilities to connect with people. But I didn't have that much experience with him either.
Why was he a one-term governor?
He was a one-term governor because he was a Republican who dared to suggest that New Jersey needed a broader base of revenue in order to deal with all the things that were going on in the state and the growth that was taking place, and if we wanted to maintain a connection to a changing economy. He put forward a proposal that grew out of a typical commission that had been set up to deal with the issue of taxes, that recommended a statewide property tax, and also recommended, if I'm not mistaken, an income tax. He could get about 3 sponsors for that bill in the Assembly. And it raised what was probably one of the first of the right-wing, we want lower taxes, small government causes in the form of Charlie Sandman, the congressman from Cape May County, who I think was the very last congressional defender of Richard Nixon as he went off in his helicopter. I think Charlie Sandman was still supporting Nixon. But Sandman saw an opportunity and took him on in the Republican primary, and he lost. And it wasn't close as I remember, but it also created the situation for in combination with Watergate, it created the circumstances for the 1973 blowout. I mean, against Cahill, I don't think it would have been 66, Democrats in the Assembly and whatever the number was in the Senate.
What's your first recollection of Brendan Byrne? When did you first hear of him or meet him?
Well, I heard of him actually when I was working for Dick Hughes, because he was the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission, Public Utilities Board. I can't remember exactly what it was called. I'm pretty sure he was president of it, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the commission in those days.
Right. And I met him once when he came down to see the governor. And I remember that he wore white bucks, and he wore a blue Susucker suit, and was a good-looking guy, and had a reputation for affability, and I think, frankly, that part of that reputation was that he liked tennis. He didn't want to work that hard, but was highly regarded for his intelligence and as I said, I just met him very briefly. That was my first encounter with him. He was out of Essex County. And that meant that he was from an organization that was first Denny Carey and then Harry Lerner. And that he wasn't thought of, I don't think, but maybe I'm wrong, because I was not really the political insider. He was not thought of as a bitter foe of the Democratic establishment in Essex County when he was on the utility board.
That establishment, Dennis Carey, Harry Lerner, was it malevolent? Was it sinister? Was it heavy-handed? Or was it just normal?
Well, I don't know what normal means in New Jersey Democratic politics, but let me say this, that the Democratic chair in Essex County, well, the best way to describe what it was is to recall Denny Carey's quip at his retirement dinner, which has probably already been offered to you. But Denny Carey had been the longtime chair of the Democratic Party, and he decided who the candidates would be. And in an amazing, statistically improbable coincidence, he was able to ensure that in every general election, row A would go to the Democratic Party. And he had his signs and placards all printed up every year. Row A, vote row A all the way, because Nick Caputo was the county clerk, and he would always draw the Democratic ball reaching into the, but anyway, Denny Carey decided to step down, and they had a big retirement dinner for him. And the word that came back, I was not there, but this has been so off-quoted, I believe it was actually said. Denny Carey stood up and thanked everybody, and he says, "Well, you won't have to be running any bingo games for Denny Carey." By which I think he meant, I'm taken care of, thanks, guys. So I think that the reputation of the Essex organization was not too different from that of the Hudson organization, that it was a place that where pay-to-play was well established. And there were reports about the costs, for example, of securing a Senate nomination. Now, I don't know if those reports were true. No, I've never seen that anybody was ever indicted or convicted because of that. But I heard them often enough that I believe that there might have been a grain of truth to it.
Meaning if you want to be put forward by the organization for state senate, you had to contribute a certain amount to the organization?
Yes, right. And that contribution might actually be in cash, or parts of it might be in cash. And this was in the day before ELEC, or before the required disclosure, or all those things that took place under Brendan Byrne.
And where that cash ultimately ended up,
who knows?
Who knows?
Right.
We have echoes of that today.
Yes, we do.
Yes, we
do.
Tape this. The governor of Illinois is in the news today. Do you think that the Middlesex organization under David Wilentz was comparable to what you just described?
I knew less about that, and I heard fewer examples of that, so I don't know.
What was your impression of Wilentz, David Wilentz?
Well, first of all, my knowledge of him was not that great. I met him, at things like a dinner or something, and I might be introduced to him, and I'm sure he quickly forgot. I did meet him later in a more relaxed setting. Smart guy, obviously, but I always thought of Bob Wilentz as the personification of the Wilentz family in public life, and of course he was one of the most highly respected members ever to serve in the New Jersey legislature, and for good reason. I mean, he was a very smart, articulate. He could frame an argument as well as anybody I've met, and they actually would be quiet on the floor of the assembly when Bob Wilentz was speaking, which is a testimony to his command, I think, and of course his career was capped off with being Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so I think of Middlesex County as having a slightly different approach, with more attention to merit in the selection of candidates. Yeah.
Did you think that Cahill was in trouble politically as the '73 campaign began?
I did not. It's a good question.
So Sandman came out of the blue?
I don't think he came out of the blue. I think that the expectation was that knocking off an incumbent governor there was just too much juice to go with being governor. I was not paying that much attention to the Republican primary because I was thinking of having recently moved to Morris County. I was thinking, we had this thing happen in 1971 where for the first time since 1911, a Democrat had actually won a legislative election in Morris County.
Who?
Ann Klein. And I think she did it because she was smart and well organized and ran a great campaign. I think she snuck up on the Republicans in an off year. I don't think they were ready for this. And she squeaked in
On an assembly seat?
In an assembly seat. And that was the first time since 1911 that the Democrats had taken an assembly seat or a legislative seat of any kind. And then Ann decided that she would run for governor. And the districts, because of the Baker versus Carr and all of that, the districts that prevailed in '71 were changed for '73. And they were changed in a way which decreased their attractiveness to a Democrat because it removed Parsippany, which was the largest town in Morris County, and then run by Henry Luther, who was the mayor of Parsippany, and a fairly reliable Democratic place. So it replaced that with towns like Mendham Township and Harding Township, which are 10-to-1 Republican places. I lived in Mendham Township. My wife, Blair, was pregnant with our second kid. We knew that our house was too small and we'd have to move. And I had a job with a tax-exempt foundation. And we didn't know many people in Morris County. The people we knew, Blair had met primarily through playing field hockey or being involved as a volunteer in the Anne Klein campaign. But we had 5 families that were pretty close to us. We had a dinner one night, and I said, I'm thinking of running for the assembly, and each one of you has a veto because otherwise I can't put this together. And I explained why I thought it might be a good time to run. And everybody went along. So the entire campaign was put together out of that group, and 73 turned out to be a highly unusual year. And I had a primary in Republican Morris County, and then a blowout. And so I won by 4,500 votes. Steve Wiley was elected to the Senate from the same district, and Rosemary Totero was elected from the same district.
She also a Democrat?
Yes.
So the Democrats swept the district in 73?
Yep.
So you went to Trenton?
I went to Trenton.
Did you maintain your Fund for New Jersey?
I did. I had to
job?
work out a very careful, almost contract with the Fund for New Jersey because it was a grant-making foundation, so that I received a reduced salary. I had to keep careful time records, which I submitted monthly, I think. I had to keep track of my phone calls, so I would note those calls which were on legislative business. I'd reimburse the fund if I had made them on the fund telephone. The same thing with photocopying. I had asked my secretary not to do anything connected with politics except to answer phone calls, but yeah, so I did continue.
So you won election the same year that Brendan Byrne
Yes, I did.
won election.
Right.
At what point, well, let me go back a second. Brendan Byrne had a complicated primary.
Yes, he did.
Anne Klein was in
Part
that
of it.
primary.
Right.
Were you part of the Klein team?
I was not against Anne Klein, but I think I used legitimately the fact that I had a primary and I was not going to take public sides on the campaign. I didn't have any time to do it. I was trying to raise money and get around to 18 towns, and where I didn't know anybody in most of them.
So you weren't aligned with anybody?
I was not. I was on no line. I was neutral.
And then once, well, were you surprised that Brendan Byrne emerged the winner of the primary?
No, I was not.
Why?
Because he had the benefit of having Craybill and Dick Coffey, and did somebody else drop out? I don't remember. Maybe there was a third candidate who dropped out. Which put 2 counties solidly behind him. And
Middlesex and Mercer.
right.
And he had Essex?
No, he didn't. Ralph DeRose was the organization candidate.
Oh, Hudson he had, right?
Yeah, and he had Hudson, right. That's because Paul Jordan was the reform mayor of Jersey City, and they still controlled the organization. So he did have Hudson. I can't remember where Bergen was.
Stosky didn't run.
He did not run. Right. So I think that's right. It was the fact that he had Hudson and Middlesex and Mercer going in. I can't remember where Camden was either. But anyway, I was not surprised that he won.
So it's all about putting counties together.
That helps. By the way, I still have in my office the poster that Brendan Byrne ran on in the Democratic primary. I framed it. I took it out of a wastebasket in, I think, Newark. And it's a great shot, black and white shot of Brendan Byrne, the man who could not be bought. Democratic primary, June 3rd. It's a great poster.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of my favorites, anyway.
After Byrne wins the primary, did you try to avoid appearing with him?
No, not at all. I didn't. And in fact, I recall that maybe the first time when he was a candidate and I was a candidate, he did come to Morris County, and I was happy to have him there. Because I sensed, don't forget, I'd never run for office before.
How old were you in 1973?
73, I was 31. Is that right? Yeah, if my math works out, yeah, I was 31. I remember the first time I met Steve Persky, he asked me the same question, because he wanted to be the youngest member of the General Assembly. No, I was happy to see Brendan Byrne come to Morris County. First of all, he had been the assignment judge in Morris County and had been so there was some connection there. Secondly, he had a resume that worked pretty well in Hudson County, in Morris County. He was a graduate of Princeton and Harvard Law School. People respected that. Thirdly, he had the benefit of Watergate breaking wide open at the time, and also that his opponent was Charles Sandman. The Republican Party in Morris County at that time was in the hands of the Rockefeller Republicans, if you will. I mean, they were the old line, waspy, wealthy, gentrified people. Al Merck was my opponent in that, a scion of the Merck pharmaceutical fortune, you know. John Dorsey, a graduate of Yale and Yale Law School, was my other opponent. And so, I mean, you know, this was a place that cared about that stuff, or it didn't hurt. So I was happy to have Brendan Byrne come in. I remember thinking, gosh, I wish he were a little more emphatic in the way he spoke.
What was he like as a campaigner?
He was not as emphatic as I thought he should be. Let me put it this way. He did not take over the room in quite the same way that Barack Obama takes over a room, or in the way that Bobby Kennedy could take over a room. He has a very halting style. Still does, right? But he was the Democratic nominee in a year that felt pretty good, so he got a very good reception.
All right, Gordon, we're going to take a break and we'll resume in a moment.
All right.
Let's stay with the 1973 campaign for a bit. Dick Leone, who would become Brendan Byrne's perhaps closest advisor, was a friend of yours at the time?
Yes.
Right? So what was your involvement during the campaign with Leone?
It was sporadic, and if I wanted information about what was going on with the campaign that I thought might be helpful in mine, I would call Dick, and if he was looking for, you know, similar kind of advice from the field, he would call me.
How close were you?
How close?
Yeah.
I mean, as friends, you mean?
How did you know each other?
Well, we were both in the same class at the Woodrow Wilson School.
Class
and we
of?
65. And we roomed together with Cliff Goldman and Nick Lamont, Alan Rosenthal's former brother-in-law. If you want to talk about small worlds.
And you stayed close with Leone between 65 and 73?
Yeah, between 65 and 08. Yeah, no, I mean, right. Dick was an usher in my wedding in 1967.
And he was not with Brendan Byrne initially during that campaign?
Well, if you remember, Brendan Byrne didn't become a candidate until very late. Didn't become an official candidate. I don't know who was with Brendan Byrne before Dick was, because I don't think there was much of an organization. This thing came out of nowhere from my perspective, which is where the line about the man who couldn't be bought came from, was Ronnie Sullivan's lead column 6 story in the New York Times. Maybe it wasn't column 6, but it was a prominent story, which I think may have been 2 days before filing deadline. It was very close to the end, and Craybill and Coffey both folded and endorsed Byrne. There had been reports before that, but I think his resignation from the bench and his announcement as a candidate came the same day.
So when Coffey withdrew as a candidate, Leon, who was with Coffey, moved over with Byrne as Coffey did.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't remember exactly how that worked out, because I don't think. Well, I think that Byrne and Leon probably knew each other from Hughes' days, but I don't know that it was very close.
At what point in the summer or fall of '73 did it become clear that Brendan Byrne was going to win the election?
Well, I don't know that it became. You had. I don't know when it became clear, because first of all, we didn't have statewide polls that were published regularly that I can remember. Did the Eagleton poll exist then? It might have. The Fund for New Jersey started the Eagleton poll. I should remember this. Maybe the Eagleton poll existed, but I don't have a strong memory of that. There certainly was no Quinnipiac or Marist or anything else like that. What you had was a very unusual year, not too different from 2008 in a lot of ways. For example, I would campaign at the railroad stations, the commuter stations in Morris County. I'd started in Dover, which was at the far end, and which was the guys who had to get up really early because they were back office guys to be on Wall Street, And then I would end up in Madison, and which is when the bankers would be getting on. And the reception wasn't very different between the two. I mean, you could just tell something was going on. And I would hand out something, and they'd say, I don't care for your literature. Just tell me what party you are. And I said, I'm a Democrat. You got my vote. And this was with all these, quote, Republican-looking bankers who were coming to get on the train. And you just had this sense of a tide that was going to wash over the Republican Party that year.
Was that all Richard Nixon, or did it have anything to do with what was happening?
It was the
in
combination.
New Jersey?
It was the combination, it was the combination of you had, by New Jersey standards, and by 1973 standards, you had a fairly ideological right-wing candidate running. It was before all that really hardened, and but Charlie Sandman was a hard right-wing politician, and he was from the deepest South in the second smallest county, or maybe the smallest county.
Cape May.
Yeah. So he had a weak base, although he was a member of Congress, so he represented one of the, at the time, 15 congressional districts. He had defeated a moderate Republican. The people in Morris County were moderate Republicans by and large. And so I just had a sense that even for somebody on the down ballot as a member running as for the General Assembly, that there was a fighting chance I could win this thing. I mean, I had some sense of optimism in the fall.
You said you won by 4,500 votes. Is that a lot?
It's a huge number. Legislative districts at the time were 180,000, 170,000. Pretty good turnout that year, but
that was their total, what? Registered
population.
Voter or population?
Population.
Population.
Yeah, registered voters would have been under 100,000. And so with a pretty good turnout, it was probably 55, 45, 57, 43.
How did it feel to win?
Oh, it felt great. I mean, first time, nobody expected it. And I had done it, Blair and I talked about it, and I said, look, sometime I'm going to want to run for public office. Given that we've moved to Morris County, there will never be a good time. Even though we've got one small kid and another one on the way, and we're going to have to move out of this house sometime soon, let's do it now. let's get it out of the way. So it was sort of done with that spirit. And the expectation was that I wouldn't win. So anyway, it made me more relaxed, perhaps. And we had to build an entirely new organization. And it was made up heavily of independents and Republicans.
Let me step back again for a second, back into the Cahill years. He's often credited with having ushered the Meadowlands into being, but the roots of that go back into the Hughes administration. Did you play a role with Hughes in getting that off the ground?
No, I'll tell you what. What Hughes created was the Hackensack Meadowlands Development Commission, which was the vehicle to stop the atomized and intensive development of the Meadowlands. One of the reasons that that resolution to amend the Constitution was so important to Hughes was that there were a lot of tidelands in the Hackensack Meadowlands. And this was where the certainty of its value was being set, because at that time, I don't know what the number would be in 2008, but in 1969 or 68, there were parts of the Hackensack Meadowlands that were selling for $100,000 an acre. This was Midtown Manhattan sort of prices, you know. I mean, this was because of location and because of vacant land, and there was so little of it. And so to prevent the balkanization of all of that, through Paul Ilvesacker and Cliff Goldman at the Department of Community Affairs, and Fairleigh Dickinson, who was the Republican senator from Bergen County, the idea of putting together a sort of a super planning agency with real teeth emerged. And Dick Hughes was a big apostle of it and got it passed. And so what Cahill inherited was nothing that was directly connected to a football stadium. What he got was at then embryonic effort to plan for both the conservation and the development of, I can't remember what it is, 14,000 acres in one of the most densely populated places in the United States. Most of it vacant.
Did you ever go up there with Hughes?
I don't think I did.
All right. You're newly elected to the Assembly. A new Democratic governor is on his way in. What's the first issue or event that heralds this new era in your memory?
Is going to the reception, the breakfast for returning and newly elected legislators, the Democratic caucus. So it brought me in with, Dick Cody was elected for the first time that year. He was there, and Alan Karcher, who had been the appointments secretary in Dick Hughes' office, he was there. Steve Persky, who mentioned before, he was there. He had already served one term.
Was this a huge new class of Democrats?
Oh, huge. It was 66 Democrats, 14 Republicans. Huge.
And this was the Watergate.
The Watergate. It was the Watergate class. It was a wipeout.
And it was all a year before Nixon had to resign.
Yes, but it was the year of the Sam Ervin hearings. Yeah. And it was the year of and I think by that time the tapes had been discovered. By that time John Dean had testified. People were
'73.
Yeah, people were running away from Nixon, and except Charlie Sandman. So you combine those two things, and he was on the Judiciary Committee. Joe Mariziti was too. So you had two New Jersey congressmen who were among the last holdouts.
Mariziti was from where?
Morris County, Boonton.
So what did you tackle as a legislator?
Well, first of all, I didn't have much idea about what to do. First, there was no tradition of Democratic legislators going down from Morris County. Ann Klein, yes, she had been there, but she was very busy becoming the commissioner for what I guess was still called institutions and agencies.
It would become human services.
Human services. Maybe they changed the name then. So I was a little, and I'd done a little bit of work with the legislature, but not that much. And the Republicans ran the legislature, so my knowledge was not as great as one might have hoped. So the first question was, can I get on the right committees? And it turned out that I got on the committees that the Byrne administration wanted to get me on. There was one committee that I wanted to get on that I got on.
Which was?
The Utilities and the Energy Committee, whatever it was. It was the gas crisis. And I wanted to be on that committee. And that was a good one to get on. And then the Byrne people asked me to be on the Taxation Committee. And I said, come on, please. And
you didn't want to be on the taxation?
well, no, I didn't want to be on the taxation.
Why? You knew they were going to raise taxes?
Yeah, because I knew there's something was going to happen that would probably involve a yes vote for a tax. And in the end, I said yes. I'd be happy to. And the fact that Persky was chair of it was convinced me. The fact that Leon was the treasurer helped. So I went on this.
Was Cliff Goldman there yet? No.
Cliff Goldman was the deputy treasurer.
Deputy treasurer.
Right.
So your two good buddies were in the Treasury Department.
That's right.
And the guy you respected who came in with you.
No, he was a year. He was a second term. But he and I had formed a pretty quick friendship when he found out that I was older than he was. And Doc Woodson was the Speaker of the Assembly.
Howard Woodson.
Howard Woodson.
First African-American speaker.
First African-American speaker.
Only African-American speaker.
I guess that's right.
Yeah.
And he was from Mercer. I had lived in Mercer. I knew Doc a little bit. And he
How
was...
was he?
Well, he was he had a fairly casual approach to it, I think. He wasn't a stickler, for example, about starting on time. He wasn't a stickler about too much whipping going on in the Democratic caucus. So this was not only the legislature, which I think until very recently met in more sessions than any other legislature, because we ended up having the tax crisis, which led to the closing of the schools a year later. But we had the energy crisis, we had, frankly, a pretty inefficient General Assembly. So we would be called down for a 2 o'clock board opening, and the board would open at 6. People would be starved to death. We'd break at 8 to get dinner. We'd come back at 10. I'd get home at 4 a.m. in the morning. And that happened fairly frequently. And
Do you attribute that to Woodson's loose
well,
style?
let me say this. It didn't help. First of all, you had a herd of cats, right? You're trying to, so you had people from Morris County, where you have, once a century they allow a Democrat to go to Trenton, so they've got a pretty fragile case that they're trying to put together for re-election from heavily Republican areas. And then you have a bunch of new suburban Democrats coming in from suburban Camden County, suburban Burlington County, suburban Middlesex County, where there had not been steady Democratic representation. And a lot of big egos, of course, because they're politicians. And little splits here and there in the organization counties. So you had a few guys in Hudson who weren't going along with the boys, and you had a crazy caucus situation, and getting things done in the caucus was tough. And you also had problems over on the Senate side, putting together the votes over there.
Also because of large numbers?
No, partly because of that, but also because the leadership of the Senate was not as fully behind the program of the administration as the Assembly was.
Who was the leader in the Senate?
Pat Dodd was the president. Jim Dugan, but I think Pat Dodd was the president first 2 years. Because Kathy Crotty came down with him.
Dugan was Judiciary.
Jim
Dugan was
the chairman of the Senate Judiciary
Yes,
Committee?
yeah.
And why were they not on board with Byrne?
You'll have to ask them. They're both still around, right? Well, I don't know. First of all, I think that I don't know. Dugan was Hudson, and he was sort of Jordan, right? But he was not so. He was not a reform guy like Jordan was. But in the end, I don't know.
You talked about the Assembly Democratic Caucus as a herd of cats.
Yeah.
Is it more difficult to maintain party discipline when you have a huge majority?
I think so. Well, first of all, you can give up 25 votes and still get something passed when you got 66. So
if it's controversial, there's a scramble to be one of the 25?
yeah. So the income tax. I mean, they could say that I was the 41st vote.
They can say it of anybody who voted for it.
Right. And
I want to talk about your recollection of the income tax fight, but first I want to ask you about the gas crisis of 1973. You say you were interested in tackling it as a legislator?
well, I thought the whole thing was going to be an issue, and why not be on a panel where you might get some attention?
Was it an issue?
Yeah, but it actually turned out that the legislative solution to it came up pretty quickly. That was odd even gas sale days, and we did that pretty quickly. And I can't remember beyond that. There were then you do the sort of symbolic stuff, but the odd even was put in place very quickly. It was done by statute, and it was a quick and effective response. I mean, it really did cut the lines and reduce some of the angst.
The last digit of your license plate determined
Yes.
whether you were an odd or an even,
Right.
and only even could buy on one day and
Yep.
only odd on another
Yep.
day?
Yeah.
How long do you think that held? Do you recall?
Well, it wasn't required for long because the real shortage didn't last that long. But as long as there were shortages, this did reduce the lines, and it stopped people from, when they were 3/4 full, getting in line because they were certain there would never be any gas again. So it stopped that, and it cut the lines down, and people were more assured that they'd be able to get gas on their day, and so I think it worked.
Any idea where it originated?
I don't
the executive
remember.
branch or the legislature?
I don't remember. I know that it came through our committee, but rather quickly and without much discussion.
Did it lead to the creation of an energy office of some sort?
I think it did, yeah. I'm trying to recall the particulars of that. And I do remember that Joel Jacobson, right? Yeah, Joel Jacobson was made the first commissioner of whatever it was that we set up. And that, I think, incorporated the Public Utilities Commission. It did.
And who was Joel Jacobs?
Joel Jacobson was a UAW regional official at a time when the UAW had substantial membership in New Jersey, because you had plants in Mahwah and Linden and Edison, and you had big plants. And Ewing, you had quite a presence. And the regional headquarters for the Northeast was in Cranford, and Joel was a regional officer. He had been very active in Democratic politics, a real progressive guy, and had been a big supporter of Brendan Byrne.
And did he pan out as energy commissioner?
I don't know if I followed it that closely.
When you were running for assembly, did you talk about the income tax at all?
Not if I could avoid it. In the primary, I had circulated something that said it may come to pass, circumstances may require consideration of a broad-based tax to deal with this issue, and which would raise the question of, it was sort of like, yeah, you probably will get a guy who's going to vote for the income tax. And I did not include that in any of my general election literature.
You did not.
I did not.
Where was your heart?
Oh, I knew if the income tax came up, I would vote for it.
Tell us the story of your role in the creation of the state income tax.
Well, there was a 9-member taxation committee, and there were 6 Democrats and 3 Republicans. One Democrat was an uncertain to negative vote on the income tax, and one was afraid of it. And the rest of us were pretty strong. And the question was, how would the income tax be structured, and how would it deal with property taxes, and what would it do to deal with the Robinson-Cahill school finance case in terms of how would you structure that? And the administration came up with what I thought was a very saleable proposal, and it had to do with the introduction of a circuit breaker based on a program that Wisconsin had already implemented. I'm pretty confident of that. And the idea was that there would be a ceiling on the percentage of your disposable income or your gross income that could be paid in property taxes. After that, basically the state would subsidize your municipality and pay the rest of the bill. And if it was 5% and your property tax bill was 6.5%, and that was $640 that was above the ceiling, the state would pay the municipality $640. And the income tax proceeds would be used to pay for that. And that was a big chunk of the new revenues that would be generated by the imposition of an income tax. The rest of it would go primarily to a new school aid formula, as I remember. So the question was, what did you have to do to get this idea understood and across? So we went on the road with a lot of hearings, and we held them jointly, as I recall, with the Senate committee. And Bernie Dwyer, I think, was the chair of the tax, whatever the committee was called on the Senate side. And I know that we held a number of joint public hearings with the Senate. And maybe 5 or 6 around the state. Explanation, public comment, question and answer, trying to get the idea across. By the time we had fashioned the final legislation to move it from the committee to the floor, I was pretty enthusiastic about it. I think we had a damn good bill, and one that I could run on in Morris County. Because I had worked it out, and the Treasury had worked it out in terms of the impact on residents of each legislative district, as they always do. And in my case, I had more winners than losers, and it was by a pretty good margin in one of the wealthiest districts in the state. I mean, it's actually a district that's sort of half blue collar and half white collar, but as it worked out, most people would benefit from this plan. And I was prepared to run enthusiastically for re-election, assuming that the first year of this plan would have already been in place. And of course, what happened was that the Senate balked. And in particular, the aforementioned Senators Dugan and Dodd. And so we never got it through the Senate. Therefore, it was never.
It passed the Assembly?
Yeah, it passed the Assembly. And it passed the Assembly 41 to whatever. I mean,
And did your opponent in '75 call you the 41st vote for an income tax?
not only my opponents, but my running mate,
Who was that?
Rosemary Totero, who had run as a League of Women voter candidate, pro-income tax, 2 years before. And then she voted against it and said it wasn't progressive enough. And so I had 3 opponents in the election. She was beating the shit out of me on it, and so were the Republicans. So, but I never thought that I lost because of the income tax. I mean, she lost. She lost by about 600 votes. I lost by 1,100 votes. I think the difference was that the AFL-CIO came out against me, and they endorsed her.
Why did they come out against you?
Because, oh, I know, I was on the Transportation Committee. Transportation and Public Utilities is what it was called. Mike Esposito from Hudson County was the chair. There was going to be a transportation bond issue, and this was the time of great growing environmental awareness. And the administration came out with a plan that attracted the opposition of the environmental lobby at the time, because it was too heavily weighted to highways. And it was a pretty big bond issue, as I remember. Being on that committee and being from a district where being environmental was not a bad thing to be, and also just having a personal belief in that, I went to work with the environmentalists, the Transportation Department, the Environmental Protection, the Department of Environmental Protection, and with the AFL-CIO and the building, the contractors, to try and put together a package that would be opposition-free from organized interests, on the grounds that if you have organized opposition to a bond issue, it'll go down, which has been the pattern in New Jersey and continues to be. And we worked pretty hard at it. And I put together a package that the administration was interested in, and I had help from people. And Alan Sagner was the Commissioner of Transportation, and he was a friend of mine. And Leon was the treasurer, and he was a friend of mine. So, I mean, I could do some work with people. And I was close to the environmental lobby. And we put something together which was acceptable to everybody, except Charlie Marciani,
The head of the AFL-CIO.
the head of the AFL-CIO, who announced his opposition to it very late and circulated letters to every member of the legislature that if you vote for this compromise bond issue, we're coming after you. And so, since I was the primary author of the bond issue, whether my name was on it or not, of course I stayed with it, and Rosemary did not. And we got it through. It was a squeaker again, and I think we got, most of the Republicans to vote for it. And sure enough, the AFL, he kept his word. You couldn't fault him for that. He came after me, and I think that was the difference between her losing by 600 votes and me losing by 1,100 votes. I don't think the income tax played.
You don't. So
I
you
don't.
served one term in the Assembly.
Right.
And you worked to pass an income tax, but no income tax ever passed both houses.
Not during that
your time.
During that term, no.
Were you surprised when Brendan Byrne proposed an income tax?
Not too surprised. I think we all had the idea that the campaign language was regrettable, and that the foreseeable future came as quickly as it did.
He had said he didn't see the need for an income
Not in the
tax
foreseeable future. Right. Then he came back. Well, then we ran into some budget problems, and they came back for a sales tax increase, as I remember, right? And that created a little tension between Brendan and myself, because they wanted to put in a sales tax increase. Pretty sure it was sales tax. And they had the members of the Democratic members of the Taxation Committee and some of the leadership out to Morven. And as a part of the squeeze, Brendan Byrne had put a freeze on any increases in state salaries for that year, and which made sense, and under the circumstance, regrettable and all that, but you have to do what you have to do, and I wasn't against that, except that he didn't have it apply to the governor. And so every story that came out about the salary freeze included a sidebar about the governor's keeping his. And so we went out, and I stood up and I said, at this meeting of the leadership, I said, look, I mean, we'll consider what you think we have to consider, but I said, I'm not considering any sales tax increase as long as the governor keeps his salary increase. And this is an object of ridicule and jokes, and people don't think it's fair, and I don't either. And Brendan Burns stood up and said, I'm not going to let Ronnie Sullivan decide what, I've got a family to support. And I said, well, I accept all that, and I
Wait a
sympathize.
minute, this was a meeting that included the governor?
Yeah, oh yeah.
A meeting of the legislative leadership
Yeah,
and the governor?
right.
About salaries?
About sales tax.
About the sales tax, okay.
And
And he defended his own increase?
he defended his own
based
increase.
on his 7 children?
And he did, and I said, I'm sympathetic to that. And I said, but what I said stands. I'm not voting for any increase as long as you get a salary increase.
And how did that issue play out?
Jerry English stood up and said, you can't talk to the governor that way.
We're just about to take a break, but in the final minute and a half or 2 minutes we have for this section, at that point in time, was Brendan Byrne a good governor?
Well, he had put together and made a proposal that I thought was the best tax proposal New Jersey's ever seen. Took a lot of crap for it. He stayed with it, I thought, and showed firmness. Yeah, I'd say my basic, in my short time there as a member of the legislature, I'd say, yeah, we did a lot of things that were good things. And he was behind them and supported them. The Public Advocate was created. The Open and Public Meetings Act was enacted. People still rail against it. I think it's a pretty good law. So I think there were good things done, and of course he had good majorities to work with. I think that he got better in the second term. And I think he got better in how he dealt with contention, and I think he became more effective as a politician in the second term.
Well, when we resume, we'll pick up in 1975, find out what you did,
Okay.
and talk about Brendan Byrne in his second term. So you lost the election in 75, and what did you then do?
I was still working at the fund, and I stayed at the fund. I went back doing that full time and making mischief using their money as much as I could. Yeah.
What comes to mind when you think in terms of making mischief?
Oh, we did. First of all, we got involved in school finance litigation. Very early on, I had talked to Harold Ruvault Jr., who was the municipal solicitor for Jersey City, on his idea about bringing an action in the Supreme Court or in the courts of New Jersey on equal protection, I think he was thinking about. And we were an early supporter of the Education Law Center when that was set up. Paul Trachtenberg was the first director. We supported we always were consistent in our support for the Center for Analysis of Public Issues. That was usually our largest recipient each year. It wasn't a big foundation, but we did the Coalition for Fair Broadcasting to try and get better attention. We helped create the Eagleton poll. We looked at the issue of housing discrimination. We supported a group called the Suburban Action Institute that looked at patterns of discrimination, particularly where zoning was used to keep out affordable housing. That always came back to bite me when I ran for public office. And then I think it was the Kane administration was going to propose using a different measure for determining state ownership of the Meadowlands. Cliff and I put our heads together and hired marsh biologist from Connecticut College or somebody and weighed in on that to prevent a definition which would have led to a sharp shift in ownership from public to private. So, I mean, and then in the middle of all that, I received, hundreds of proposals a year that I reviewed and learned a lot about stuff.
Let's step back one more second into your 75 campaign. Do you remember if the governor campaigned for you?
I don't, and I don't think he did. I don't remember that he did. That's a good question.
Would you have wanted him to?
That's a good question, too. I don't think he was quite toxic yet. But I would guess that I would not have invited him. I think that one of the reasons being that my part of my campaign was that I was a fairly independent Democrat. And that I'd stood up and, that kind of thing. And so I think I probably would have not invited him. I'm pretty sure that, for example, Rosemary Totaro, my running mate, did not invite him. She was running against his tax plan.
While you were back at the Fund for New Jersey, the tax plan finally passed. Can you describe what finally caused it to succeed?
Yeah. Well, I'm now, Brendan would have a better idea than I would, but I think the legislature was backed into the corner by the closing of public schools, effective July 1st, 1976. I think that's what got it passed. And I think also the fact that the Byrne administration was willing to accept the Russo plan for the caps.
John Russo?
Yeah.
Senator.
Senator John Russo, Ocean County, and they had been persistent and consistent, and to their credit, at least willing to support a broad-based tax. And they had been early on that. I mean, John Doyle and Danny Newman were in the assembly with me, and they were talking that way in the
Caps on what? Do you recall?
caps on the rate of increase in state spending and property taxes, both.
And was that part of the final solution?
I think it was, yeah.
At some point, in 77 or 78, did Brendan Byrne nominate you or put you forward to be executive director at New Jersey Network?
Not in any formal way. Instead, I had worked on this issue of television coverage in New Jersey for a long time through the Coalition for Fair Broadcasting, setting it up. And my thought was that the New Jersey license, the New Jersey Network, which at that time was called New Jersey Public Television, should be much more enterprising and much less public television, much more New Jersey and much less public television. That it basically was a rerun on a counter schedule of what was being broadcast on channels 12 in Philadelphia and channel 13 in New York. And I thought that the news programming could be improved. I thought that there should be more programming, more niche programming about New Jersey to cover the outdoors and the arts and other things. And that it was probably necessary to change the leadership at New Jersey Public Television for that to happen. And basically, with others, I worked on doing that. And so I think that to be precise about it, I think the governor approved my selection by the New Jersey Public Broadcasting Authority as the executive director.
What year was that?
78. 79. 79 was April 79 is when I started there.
Did you do anything significant besides run the Fund for New Jersey between 75 and 79?
I left the fund to run Dick Leone's Senate campaign.
Why?
Well, we're friends.
How'd you do?
Not well.
Why not?
Well, we were running against Bill Bradley, who was better known. I mean, because he was a Rhodes Scholar. And I think a lot of people had read his senior thesis at Princeton, and were drawn to him. So we had an uphill battle.
He also could shoot basketball.
He could shoot basketballs. No, he was a tough opponent to have, and Leon was not a natural favorite of a lot of the organizational Democrats.
Why?
Well, I think they set a pretty, I think he and Cliff, when they ran the Treasury, set a pretty tough standard for doing public business, and could be pretty frank about it. So Dick had made a few enemies along the way.
Who did Burns support?
Dick Leon.
Why?
Well, he was had been his treasurer, his campaign manager. I have to ask Brendan that.
You think it was reluctantly, because he had to, or do you think it was wholeheartedly?
Oh, I think it was. I think he'd prefer to stay out of it, is my guess, but I never asked him that. But his people, particularly Harold, was very helpful. So.
Harold Hodes.
Harold Hodes, right.
Did it look like a difficult task at the time to run against this celebrity, or was he such a neophyte to either politics or New Jersey that you thought you had a decent chance with an inside expert?
I thought it would be very difficult. I thought it would be very difficult. I thought it was so difficult that I thought that Dick shouldn't do it.
But once he decided to do it, you were there with him?
Yeah.
Do you recall advising him not to do it?
Yes.
And why do you think he didn't listen?
Well, he may have listened.
Why do you think he didn't heed your advice?
I think he wanted to do it. I don't know. I think people... First of all, he's always had a fresher and better informed view of politics than I have, I've thought. He's a really smart guy when it comes to politics. And maybe that got in his own way when he was thinking about his own candidacy. Maybe he wasn't as clear thinking about it as he was about anybody else's candidacy, because he is a very good read on things like that. But I don't. In the end, I don't know. I think he wanted to do it.
Did they debate Bradley and Lee?
I don't think they did. And Alex Menza was also a candidate, who was a state senator and who would later be a judge, and a beloved, and probably the closest thing to a certified liberal in New Jersey, right? So it was a three-way race, and even if Alex had not been in, I think Bradley still would have won the primary.
Was the income tax an issue in the Leon?
In the primary, I don't think so.
It had been accepted by then, generally?
Yeah, no, it was accepted pretty well. Don't forget the '77 election had already been held, and that was a referendum on the income tax. That was the closest thing to a single-issue campaign that we've ever had in New Jersey. Ray Bateman bet everything. He was all in that the income tax would give him the governorship. No question about it. I think I'm right. There's never been a gubernatorial campaign where one issue was so defining about the outcome. So I think by '78, hey, it would have been throw me in the briar patch. Yeah, go ahead, attack me for having been the architect of the income tax.
Where were the key county leaders in that U.S. Senate primary in '78?
They were primarily with Leon, but not entirely. But they were not so enthusiastically.
And your own home was divided.
That's right.
In terms of loyalties.
That's right.
Your wife was prominent in the Bradley campaign?
Yes, she was. She was the co-chair of it with John McPhee. Tough thing to go through.
Was it?
Oh, horrible. Well, you know what, I mean, maybe you don't. There is nothing more intensive that I've ever experienced than a political campaign. I mean, it's like, I can imagine that it's like being on the, the surgical wing of a hospital where it doesn't matter what time it is. You've got jobs to do, and it never ends, and that the time is different than it is for people on the outside. That's what a campaign's like. It's very intensive, and it's also, unlike surgery, the results are always clear, right? Unless it's Florida 2000 or Minnesota 2008. But it's a mathematical certainty about what happens, and it happens on a certain day, and it's over. And until then, it's it's a very intensive, tough
You
experience.
got press attention, you and Blair,
Yes.
over the fact that you were on opposite sides.
Yes.
Did you try to avoid politics at home?
Yes,
Were you successful?
by and large. That's why we're still married, maybe. Maybe.
What did you think of Bill Bradley as a senator once he knocked off your close friend?
Well, first of all, I thought that he had a closer go at it with Jeff Bell than I thought he would. And then he had a closer go at it with the mayor of Montclair, whose name I can't
Mary
remember.
Machari.
Machari. Than I thought he would. And then he had a closer run with Christy Todd Whitman than I thought he would. I thought, I think Bill represented New Jersey well. I think he might have been a little clearer about the tax reform quest that he was on in terms of producing a result that in fact was simpler and clearer than it turned out to be. That was an awful lot of effort that went into a tax reform effort that seemed to me to be just another more complicated version of what it replaced. I thought that he did a real service to New Jersey and the rest of the nation in his ability to talk about race. I was proud that he was able to do that. I think his basketball credentials helped him with that. He and I talked about that.
You wrote a book about race.
I wrote a book about race that I really wanted Bill Bradley to write. And
What was the title of that book?
see if I can remember it. Well, let me see, because the movie had a different title. Wrong for all the right reasons, how white liberals have been undone by race.
The knock on Bradley in New Jersey political circles is that his aims were so lofty and his head was in the clouds, but he didn't do the retail politics and the chicken dinners that a senator should do. What do you think about that?
I thought he did a fair amount of chicken dinner stuff. I think that he, I think he did have lofty ideas about stuff that didn't always connect. I think it's hard to translate that into street language in a way that people grab it right away, and I don't think he was great at doing that. So,
Did it hurt when Leon lost?
yeah, sure. You never want to lose a campaign after what you put into them.
Does it hurt more to lose than it feels good to win?
That's a hard question to answer. I think it feels better to win than, yeah. I think winning is better. I mean, look, if you're a Democrat in Morris County, winning is such an unusual. I ran 5 times. I won twice, and the second time was one of the highlights of my life. I mean, winning by 270 votes out of 70,000 and defeating the majority leader of the Senate.
That was
93.
1993.
Yeah.
John Dorsey was
Right.
defeated.
Right.
We remember that night.
I do too.
Let's talk about Brendan Burns' second term. You saw much of it from either the vantage point of the Fund for New Jersey or the Leon campaign or New Jersey Network. How did it look to you?
Well, I thought there was I thought that Byrne was better in the second term in terms of his capacity to communicate with people. I think that his, and I associate the second term with the Pinelands, and which I think is, one of the most important things that anybody's done in New Jersey in the last 40 years. I think that's a huge...
Restrict 1 million acres.
Right.
In terms of development.
Right.
In a state of 5 million acres.
Right. And I think that
Was that hard to do politically?
Well, very hard. I wasn't a part of that. I wasn't inside on it. I did hear stories, though, that he was very single-minded about that, which was unusual, I think, for Brendan Byrne compared to other issues. And he knew a lot about it, and he was insistent about it. He was consistent in his, and he was tough about it. That's everything that I got back, but not having been involved. So I think it's a great mark and a big measure for, big indicator for Brendan Byrne's legacy.
Some people think that John McPhee played a role in sensitizing Brendan Byrne to that issue. Did he? Do you know?
I don't know. I've heard that too, but I don't know.
Were you maintaining contacts within the Byrne administration during the second term? Were you talking to Cliff Goldman, the treasurer? Were you?
Oh, yeah.
Were you offering advice? Were you?
Not often. I mean, I wasn't. Not too. I don't think I saw myself as an advisor. I was in touch with Cliff, and we would talk about things because we're good friends, and we would play cards together, and our families see each other. So I mean, we would. And because of the Fund for New Jersey, although I left pretty quickly. I left the fund about the time Byrne's second term started. He was reelected in '77, took office in January. I think I left in February or early March.
To run a Leon campaign effort a year ahead of time?
No, he took office in
'78. Oh, right.
So,
Leon campaign
right, so I was
away.
not there for the second term much. And then just about 9 months after the Leon campaign, I became the head of New Jersey Network.
Did you enjoy that job?
Oh, I had a great time.
Why? How?
Well, I went there for a reason, and the reason was to try and change New Jersey Network into a new New Jersey television service, and much less to be an outlet for public broadcasting. Because New Jersey didn't have alternatives, and that was the goal. And when Dick Hughes, this snuck, onto the 1968 bond issue list, this snuck on, thanks to the efforts of Steve Farber and Ed Mead as an afterthought, almost. I think the amount was $7.5 million in 1968, which quite a bit more now. But the idea was to fill this vacuum that exists by New Jersey having relied exclusively on New York and Philadelphia broadcasters. And I wanted to do that. And my predecessor was less interested in that. He was a real public broadcaster. He was from Michigan. Freymire. He was from Michigan. He didn't know the state that well, although he was here for 7 or 8 years. And as I indicated, there were other people on the board of the authority that shared that view. And so a change was made, and I applied, and I was able to get it. And in doing so, working closely, particularly with John Degnan as the Attorney General, who had ex officio membership on the board, as did the Commissioner of Education, the Treasurer, Community Affairs, and then one other commissioner. So it was sort of in or of the administration, but it was supposed to have independence. And I think to a remarkable degree it did. There was one instance where the Supreme Court stepped in and stepped on a newscast about the Republican primary. But otherwise, I think it was fair to say that the news operation ran independently of the administration.
The
And-
Supreme Court would have stepped in, even if it had been a non-quasi-governmental agency?
It could not have. It was.
not.
It only could step in because it was a state agency.
Did it have to do with participation in a debate?
It had to do with it had to do with the coverage on the news program of the. There were 11 candidates or something like that for the Republican nomination in
81.
81.
Yeah.
It was a big number.
And what did the Supreme Court say? You got to cover
Got to
them
cover.
all.
Rich McGlynn wasn't getting covered. He wanted to be covered. He went to court. The court said he had to, and I basically said no. We don't. By the way, it was a jointly operated news program at that time. Herb Bloom was the news director, and he worked for both Channel 13 and for the network, which was another reason that I wanted to go to. Why I wanted to get that job was I wanted to enhance the news program, and I wanted it to get broadcast on Channel 13 to expand the audience. And so one of the first things I did was to push that. And they were under pressure from the Coalition for Fair Broadcasting to improve their New Jersey coverage, and so this worked out very well. I also wanted to see the lottery broadcast drawing on New Jersey Network. I wanted to change the name, which I did, to New Jersey Network.
New Jersey Public Television.
Right. And I also tried a number of other things to improve the marketing of it. I tried to get all of the cable stations to agree to put New Jersey Network on Channel 8. Some of them did. New York Times did not, but a majority of them did. And anyway, there were things like that that drew me. We started an awful lot of programming. State of the Arts came about at that time. We had New Jersey Outdoors. We even tried a daily sort of show that didn't work. That was more, I don't know, Mike Douglas or something. No, what was that guy's name? It was almost a variety show.
Right.
Covering New Jersey, but not from the news standpoint. And it just overwhelmed our capacity, our production capacity. But we started live coverage of the Supreme Court, live coverage of the legislature. There were a lot of things that, not on everything, of course, but so I wanted it to be a Jersey place.
Did you ever run into any conflicts with Byrne administration
Oh, sure.
over news coverage?
Oh, sure.
How'd you handle those?
I said, well, that was the call we made. You guys don't want to get into that. But the Supreme Court was different, and of course, my lawyer was John Degnan, who was the Attorney General. And John Degnan said, you can't disobey the Supreme Court. So rather than have a story, we went black, and I came on. We ran the show on Channel 13 the way we had produced it, and then I came on in the black hole and explained that you were not seeing the regularly scheduled news report at this time because we were ordered by the New Jersey Supreme Court in an unprecedented decision that we were not able to run it because some Republican candidates complained that they weren't included in the package or something like that.
How do you view, you say you wanted to enhance New Jersey's broadcast news franchise or capabilities. Right. How do you view the situation today?
Ooh, it's changed a lot. I'm not as close to it, and I think it's much more desperate as a consequence of the partnership. Channel 13 feeling less obligated on it. I don't know if they make a contribution to the news now. If so, I don't know how much it is, so I'm not really in a position to say much. I read the papers and read the body language of people at the network and feel like it's a pretty desperate situation. But we had, for the time, at least for the first 3 years that I was there, on budgets that I negotiated annually with Jay Island, who was the president of Channel 13, we had a fairly generously funded news effort. I like the fact that we've got more Jersey sense to it now than we did with some of Bloom's selection for on air, but I like the quality that we achieved, and I like the coverage that we were able to give.
How about in terms of other broadcast media covering New Jersey. Has the vision of the Coalition for Fair Broadcasting been realized? Excuse me, I'm sorry. Been realized to any degree?
Well, I think you have to be careful what you wish for, because we did succeed in getting almost every station to come and put a news bureau in New Jersey with a New Jersey assigned correspondent. It worked out better, I think, from the Philadelphia side than the New York side. And I think it worked out better from the Philadelphia side because they were in Trenton and they tended to cover more State House stuff, and they became acquainted with the politics in New Jersey better than the New York stations did, who stayed north and covered fires and murders. So as television news deteriorated, the New Jersey coverage deteriorated along with it. So I think we got less and less of the kind of stuff we were hoping to get, and more of the kind of crap that passes for television news now.
While you were at NJN, Brendan Byrne finished his
That's right.
term.
That's right.
Looking at the whole sweep of the Byrne years, was he a good governor?
Oh, he was a very good governor. He was a special governor, I think.
How so?
Well, he brought, there are some things that we probably took for granted while he was governor that in hindsight look awfully appealing now. First of all, I think he was, at the time, and this was not a very remarkable thing, I think he was a fiscally conservative governor. I think he believed the Constitution required him to certify that the revenues were available to cover the expenditures that had been approved. He was the last governor, I think, to do that, frankly. I think that and so at the time that may not have been much of a marker for judging a governor, but I think it was important. Secondly, we've already talked about some of the accomplishments that remain, and the Pinelands will remain as maybe the first item. His steering his way through the shoals of the school finance business, I think was done very well. We ended up with a school aid formula that improved the situation. It wasn't a permanent solution, but nothing will be, and nothing is. And he had to contend with the most activist Supreme Court in the United States. It helped, I think, that Dick Hughes was the Chief Justice for some of that time.
How so?
Well, Cahill, appointed Dick Hughes in the lame duck session after he was defeated, and after Byrne was elected, and he did so in consultation. I'm told, and I think this is public, in consultation with Brendan Byrne, and Brendan Byrne hailed it as a great idea. So here you have the outgoing Republican governor naming the prior Democratic governors the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now maybe that's happened someplace else. I kind of doubt it. And Dick Hughes was was a practical guy. He wanted to solve problems, and I'm absolutely convinced. I have no evidence that I could produce in a court of law that he and Byrne worked out the deal on the school finance, and including the closure of the schools on July 1st, 1976.
You're assuming that they had some kind of back channel communication?
I'm assuming they worked it out. Okay. I don't think Dick Hughes did that on his own, and I don't think, I don't know exactly what form it took. I should have asked it. Either one of them, I haven't, but I think, yeah, sure. Hughes isn't, Hughes doesn't, Hughes is not the kind of guy who would want to surprise you with a nasty thing like that. I think they worked it out. So I think he understood what was required to get school finance on a fair footing, and he did it.
Did they do it right?
Did they do which right?
school finance. This is your area of expertise now. We want to get into your area of expertise.
Nobody ever does it right. I mean, you do it as well as you can, and they did it as well as they could. You always have to compromise when you're enacting a school aid formula, because you need to get 41 votes in the Assembly and 21 in the Senate. And you can't do it by having what some judge or some academic thinks is required. You have to do it with something that will get votes. And so you change from some ideal solution to one that you can enact. And I think that, frankly, I think that the, what was it, Chapter 212 that was enacted in response to this and set the formula. It wasn't funded, but that was set the formula for school aid, was fine.
So in essence, what they said was in certain districts that have special needs, the state has to make sure that as much money gets spent on education as is being spent in the wealthiest districts in the state.
That wasn't said during Burns' governorship. That was said during Florio's governorship.
What was said during Burns' governorship?
Said during Kane's governorship, actually.
What
was said during, you cannot rely as extensively as you're relying on a system that determines the resource available for any public school system. That's determined by the level of taxable property wealth in that town. The mismatch now is that districts with substantial educational problems are also the districts where the property wealth is the least, and therefore the tax rates to get the funds are the highest, whereas in places where the educational problems are much easier, there's lots of accessible wealth, and the tax rates are low. That's not fair.
So what did the court mandate?
The court mandated a system that would relieve property poor districts of the full obligation that they had at that point were incurring, and required the state to make up for that. And obviously, given the numbers at the time, the only way to do that was with another broad-based tax.
And that principle has been refined several times over the decades.
Yeah, it's more than refined by Abbott. I mean, that was Robinson v. Cahill, first filed in 1970 or 71, decided in 1973, I think done away with in 77. And then Abbott was filed in 80 and first decided in 90, and they just handed down Abbott 19, literally, a couple of months ago, or last month. Abbott sort of changed that. And Abbott moved from it being a matter of rough equity between wealthy and poor places, which is what Robinson did, to really more, well, yeah, not only does the system have to be fair, but it has to produce, in terms of tax rates and all that, it has to produce enough money for poor districts that they can do all those things that don't have to happen in affluent places. So it's not just a question of fair taxation, it's a question of adequate money being on hand. And then they did something which is highly unusual, maybe not unique, but they not only do you need a lot more money in places where you have a lot of poor kids, but we're going to tell you how you have to spend it. And they listed all these mandates. Class size, square footage ratios in classrooms. Every elementary school has to, in these 28 districts, have to adopt something called a model of whole school reform. They told you about staffing. They told you about the number of kids that had to be in a first grade class or a seventh grade class. I mean, that's sort of bizarre. And that became the object of attention rather than the question of whether kids were getting educated.
I take it from the way you described that you think the court went too far in trying to micromanage the outcome.
I do. I think that education is I think our public conversation about education has been guarded and imprecise about the problem that we need to solve. And because of that, there is a belief widely held by people who make policy, legislators, governors, judges, justices, lawyers, bureaucrats. There's a widely held belief that when you're dealing with the educational problems of concentrated poverty, that there ought to be some formulaic answer to those problems. And we've spent 40 years as a nation looking for that answer. It doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is we're trying to solve the wrong problem. The problem we need to solve is the consequences of growing up in a lower class family, where kids are not prepared by way of language and vocabulary and complete sentences and modified nouns and verbs and encouragement to be ready to read by the time they get to kindergarten.
And more money spent on their educations isn't the answer?
It's not the answer. It's in some cases a part of the answer. However, giving money when it's not spent intelligently and effectively, you may as well not give it, because the outcomes turn out to be the same. So you have the Abbott decision now playing out in 31 districts, and you can look at spending in Asbury Park and Camden, Trenton, Patterson, and you can see that spending has ballooned, greatly increased. On a per pupil basis, it's more than doubled in just 7 or 8 years. Now, those are the highest spending districts in the state, and those in the state that spends more money per kid than any state in the union. So you now have, you know, on average, Abbott districts spend about $3,500 more than the wealthiest districts. But if they don't know what to do, it doesn't make any difference. So you have very high spending districts with very poor results. On the other hand, you do have districts where the resources have allowed for real improvement. And they tend to be lower spending Abbott districts. And in some cases, they've produced what I would describe as absolutely dramatic results, dramatically good results.
In hindsight, would another scheme have been preferable to the Robinson v. Cahill / Abbott v. Burke scheme? Would a statewide property tax to fund education, or going to county-wide school districts instead of municipal districts, is there some other thing that would have solved the problem any better?
There might be, but I don't know what it is exactly. But I think that what would have helped, first of all, I don't disagree with Robinson. Robinson got it right. You can't have places that have no property wealth being held constitutionally responsible for educating kids who actually require more attention and maybe a longer school day or something. So I'm okay with Robinson. And the state needed to take on a larger share of the educational burden. It's Abbott that I have a problem with. And in the prescriptiveness and in the lack of any humility about the difficulty of the problem they're trying to solve. And so one of the things you could have done is to say, start with what they did in 1997, say, look, we don't know exactly what should happen, but if the resources that were available to the poorest districts match those that are of the resources spent in the wealthiest districts, the so-called parity aid, let's start with that and let's see what happens. Because nobody has, that mechanical answer. So let's see what our experience is, and if we can learn enough from that experience to see if the court needs to come back into this. But let's see how close districts can get to closing this achievement gap. That's what the purpose of all of this litigation is to give kids an education that allows them to have the same choices that affluent kids have. That's the whole thing. Well, the only way you get there is to have better education, better educational outcomes. But the idea that a commissioner of education or lawyers at the Education Law Center are going to figure that out and that the Supreme Court is going to be given a choice between those two proposals, and they're going to decide, okay, we'll take part of this and part of that, we'll mix them in, and now we have the answer, and we're going to keep it in place for 10 years? Gee, I think they should show a little humility.
So what is the answer?
The answer is to accept that we've got a very difficult problem to solve, that it can be solved, but it requires more nimbleness and less regulation than prevails in our system. And we've got to learn from places where kids are really doing a lot better. And there are such places. And we tried in the first year of the McGreevey administration to say to the court, look, you got 30 districts that are Abbott districts. Now it's 31. Look at this district in particular, Union City. Look how well these kids have been doing. They've been doing a lot better than you would predict. They're doing a lot better than most of the other Abbott districts by a lot. Why is that? Here's why. And how did we get that information? We hired in the Abbott division the guy who put that together in Union City, a gifted educator who knows there aren't any easy answers. You got to try things. If they work, you build on them. If they don't, you try something else. You got to keep working, though. And so he came up with an approach that we adopted at the state level, which were with districts that were willing to work with us. It worked very well. Districts that didn't want to work with us, they've stayed flat. So this is an encouraging thing, but it's not a formula. It's not mechanical. It's not, you always need to have 3 teaspoons of this and 4 tablespoons of that, and the cookies will always taste great. Nope, doesn't work that way.
What do you think about Governor Corzine's attempt to end the Abbott designation and just say, if you're poor wherever you live, the state will supply adequate resources?
Absolutely sensible. Conceptually very sound. Very sound. Makes all the sense in the world. I don't think they convinced the court of that. I think they could have. I think they failed on 2 counts. One is they argued this on an old decision from the court, which was 1998, which was very prescriptive. Later, the court in 2003 said, well, we won't be so prescriptive. We'll let the department decide based on need and effectiveness whether all these things are really required, except for a few things. That's where they should have argued the case. They didn't. So they got stuck with the plaintiffs on all these remedies and mandates. And the second thing is they didn't show what the effect would be in each district of the new formula. And so the districts were rightfully concerned. And I think that the difficulty is you can't, in a 2-year period, for taxpayers in Long Branch, say we're going to go from, I don't know what the number is, 60% of your budget being supported by the state to 38% of it being supported by the state. And you, the property taxpayer, get to make up the difference. That would be a huge, huge increase. It's got to be laid out over a longer period for the transition. If they had done that and the court could see that each district's likely experience under this, I think they'd be fine.
The governor after Byrne, Tom Kean,
Yep.
was a teacher and
Yep.
Would later go run a university and was called the education governor.
Right.
Was he a success or a failure in the area of education? Or something in between?
Well, I think he did a couple of things that were important, that are good, that are still pretty, well, one of them's in place, one of them's not. First, he said, we ought to try out what happens with trying to improve and increase the supply of teachers. And we're going to be the first state to allow for an alternate route. If you have a liberal arts degree with a certain grade point average, and you want to teach, we're going to give you a provisional certificate. You take some other courses along the way, then you'll be a fully certified teacher. This will open up a new pipeline, if you will. That was a good thing to do. First state to do it, showed some courage. Second good thing that they did was to say, these educational problems you got to solve, not so easy. rather than us telling you what to do, let's work on it together. We're going to find people who are pretty good at this. We're going to bring you all together. You can send some teachers, you can send some supervisors, you can send some administrators. We're going to have an academy. It's going to be regional. We're going to deal with very specific problems that come to our attention from you, and we're going to see if we can't solve them together. That was a very good idea. When Florio came in, he got rid of that, or his commissioner did. Third thing they did was to say, you know, some of these districts aren't going to do it, and we're going to set up we're going to have the state take them over. So they did the first state takeover law in the nation. Conceptually not a bad idea, probably. But problem is that the state doesn't know any better than the districts that they're taking over what to do about the education. So we cleaned out some dishonest financial management. We improved the human resource business in terms of how people get hired. But in the main, in Patterson and Newark, we haven't really improved the educational outcomes. Jersey City, we've seen improvement across the board. Jersey City's ready to come back to local control. And educationally, they've done a much better job.
No, I think we can wrap.
We're not going to go into his Senate stuff.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you want to? Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Let's get back to you then. You ran New Jersey Network. Tom Kane became governor, and all the faces changed on the board at the
Over time, they sure did, yeah, right.
Broadcasting Authority, and
The chairman didn't. Steve Adubato was still the chairman when I left.
but you're replaced by someone more appealing to a Republican administration in Trenton.
I don't know, it was your associate at New Jersey Magazine,
He
as I
was.
remember.
Yes, he was. But you hired me, so
That's right.
I don't forget that. And then what did you do?
Well, an unusual circumstance arose about the time I was leaving, which was in September '83. So it was a year and a half or so, a little more than a year and a half after Kane became governor. And that was that a UHF station in Philadelphia went black. Commercial license. This had never happened before, not in a major market. And I thought, geez, I know a little bit about television, enough to be dangerous, and I know a lot about the FCC laws on licensing. I'm going to put together an investment group and try and get that license. So I did. And I came very close, and thank God I didn't win.
Why?
Because the UHF market really fell apart. Cable came in and killed it. The must-carry law was revised by the FCC, so there was no requirement that cable stations carry you. Cable carriers. So it would have been a disaster. However, I did sign a deal with the ultimate winner, and so I ended up losing very little money, having invested quite a bit, and more than the funds of investors who came in. I ran it, but they supplied the legal fees. That's what you basically are buying, and engineering studies. I did that, and then I started writing the book. I also did some consulting with foundations and nonprofits, usually on strategic stuff. I call it that. Good puzzles to try and solve. I worked with the UPS, the foundation set up by the founder of UPS, which was in Greenwich, Annie Casey Foundation. And I worked with nonprofits on stuff. And then I started working on that book.
And at what point did you decide to try to get back into the legislature?
Well, first of all, I had run in 1987 against Dorsey. He was the senator, and I was, I don't know why I thought I might be able to beat him. Maybe it was hubris. But anyway, I ran against him in 87, which was an off year, low turnout. I lost by, normally a Democrat loses 65 to 35 in Morris County. I think I lost 53-47. Then I had this book to write. On September 1, 1993, I turned in the final draft to the publisher. I came back, and Jim Florio called me and said, the Democratic candidate for Senate dropped out for health reasons. I knew that. I live in the district. The person who was going to run, we had a special convention, and they couldn't get a quorum to nominate her, so it's still open. Would you run? And it was literally September 2nd or 1st. I said, give me a day. Let me think about it. Because the filing deadline's coming up. You got to make a decision pretty soon. So I started making a few calls, and I just finished this book. I didn't have anything to do. The campaign would be over November 2nd or whatever it was. I said, what? And Dorsey had weakened himself with the use of senatorial courtesy and Marianne Espinoza Murphy. That had been a free deal. I mean, that is widely covered, not a political thing where the candidate is barking at him.
John Dorsey blocked the reappointment of Judge Marianne Espinoza Murphy over
Right.
what issue?
I don't know. I mean,
He just thought she was unfit,
I don't know.
but women around the state were
Wo-
enraged.
Women and Hispanics,
And
and
Hispanics,
and Michael Murphy, and Dick Hughes,
Michael Murphy, who was the judge's husband.
the judge's husband, and the stepson of Dick Hughes, right. Anyway, I talked to my few close friends, advisors, and because of the weakening that I think had taken place with the senatorial courtesy thing, I thought there was a shot. And Florio was up for re-election. Whitman was a weakish candidate, although I knew she would be strong in Morris County, and I thought it was worth the try. So I started raising money and hustled a couple of debates with Dorsey, and they organized the convention on, I think, September 11th, which was 2 days before the deadline, and I got nominated at the convention and used it as a chance to get people going, and found a campaign manager, a retired investment and banker who was a good friend of mine, and put together a little campaign, found a media guy, found a pollster, and went at it, and lucked out. I mean, and then basically what happened was that we did the research on his legal billing, and he had billed 4 municipalities $1 million the previous year, which would have required him to have worked, 4,385 hours, an impossible number. And I think that's why he lost.
And then you served one term.
One term.
And then you were knocked off by Tony Bucco.
Yes, I was.
Because the district reverted to form.
Yes. Well, no, it was, there's no formula on this stuff, but when I ran the first time, Florio lost my district by 25 percentage points. So at the time, I think that represented the second biggest trade switch from top to next in the last 40 years. And I think actually Bill Gormley might have been first, or maybe it was John Russo down in Ocean. I can't remember which, but I think it was second or third. when I ran for re-election, Jim McGreevey lost the district by 40 percentage points. Can't do it. You can't overcome 40 points.
How did you enjoy your 4 years
I
as
loved
a
it.
senator?
I loved it.
Why?
Well, it's what I like doing. I like to solve puzzles. I like to frame arguments. I like to argue. She gave me a lot of arguments.
She meaning the governor?
Yeah. And it started with her tax cut, and I went down fully believing I would vote for the tax cut. And but I just written a book about how dangerous the Reagan tax cuts. I mean, that was one of the themes in the book. And she announced a retroactive 5% as the first step, which everybody thought was really an easy lift, financed by cuts in the budget. And I said, I've heard this before. This is bullshit. This isn't going to happen. So I decided to vote against it. And I said, once I had decided to vote against it, I said, I better let people know why I'm voting against it, rather than just cast a no. So I sort of became the floor leader. From the Democratic caucus, where only 4 of us were going to vote against it. I mean, it was Ray Lesniak, Ron Rice, and Bernie Kenny and I. No other legislators voted against the first tax cut. No Assembly Democrats voted against it. My argument was pretty simple. Look, you said you would do it with reduced spending. That's never happened before. The budget is supposed to be presented momentarily. Why don't we wait for the budget to be presented? For every dollar you cut in spending, we'll knock off $1 in income taxes. If you can't do that, there's no cut. And they wouldn't accept the amendment, of course. They wouldn't even let an argument take place on the amendment. And then the other point I made was, why are you cutting the only tax that's constitutionally dedicated to relieving property taxes? So I had a lot of fun with that. And then as other tax cuts came down, the Democrats came around, and then the pension bond came up. And so they gave me a lot of business. Pension bond turned out to have been a huge mistake. Not that I'm prescient or smart. It was very simple that markets do go down, and that if you invest here and it comes down there, you not only have to pay the bond back, you got to make up the investment loss, which is exactly what's happened. So, and I was on the Education Committee and on the Environment Committee, 2 things that were dear to me. And they were doing another scam with the school aid formula and trying to get out of Abbott. So, as I said, they kept me busy.
Had the legislature changed in
Oh, you bet.
the House? So?
Well, the main difference is the lack of collegiality over time. Now, there weren't a lot of Republicans when I was in the Assembly in the 70s. But even with a few of them, we would still manage to squeeze into Lorenzo's or someplace for dinner, and there would be Republicans there and lobbyists and reporters and people from the front office and legislators, and it'd be great fun. And it was important that take place. And you know, in 2 years, I probably went to Lorenzo's. I went to probably 80 sessions. I probably had dinner at Lorenzo's 20 times after a session. It happened a lot. I never went to dinner once with a legislator after a session in 4 years in the Senate.
What changed it, do you think?
Well, I think the parties nationally changed it. I think it became more ideological than just political. Although not so ideological in New Jersey. I mean, the Republican Party is not hard right. I mean, it's got some people, but it's not many. It's got Garrett and people from my neighborhood. You know, Rick Merkt and Michael Patrick Carroll and Scott Garrett, people like that, and Scott Gregg. I mean, they were sort of hard-edged. Most of them aren't. But the quality of discourse changed. I think that it's...
Did the caliber of legislator change?
Well, I would argue it did, but that's because when I was there in the Assembly, we had an outstanding group of people that were interested, serious about their work, fun to be with, smart, well-spoken. Yeah, Steve Persky, Charlie Yates, Bill Hamilton, Al Burstein. I mean, it was really quite a loaded group. Now, I found in the Senate most of my colleagues were smart enough and pleasant enough. It just seemed different, and of course it was 2 decades later, and you know, the yearning for activism, public activism, had certainly been diluted, and the game had changed. It was much less pleasant. Although I have to say that in terms of the committee work that I did, where you, as a member of a minority, that's the only place you can really have any influence.
Is the governorship of New Jersey still what it was when you first touched it in the 60s?
The office itself is more powerful in a way. It's bigger, does more things. And then what happens, it depends on who's the governor. And that changes each time there's a new governor. I would say that there is, yeah, I mean, I'm biased because I was a young guy when it happened. There's not been a governor that was as effective as Dick Hughes. Best politician I've ever run into. But that's because I haven't run into Barack Obama, except to say hello and how you doing.
When you lost to Tony Bucco in 1997, and you look back on that, anything you could have done there? I think you say that McGreevey didn't do as well as
Florio had done.
As Florio had done.
Well, first of all, election night, I was astonished. I know what to expect in Mine Hill or Morris Township if I'm going to have a chance to win. I've run in these districts, in that district 5 times. My son was working in the campaign. I called him for the first town to report. It was Mine Hill, a small working class town, which I've always won when I've won. And it was close. I said I knew it was over. And then my own town, Morris Township, came in, which I carried, which is unusual, but I carried it by a much smaller amount, and I knew it was over. So I couldn't figure out why I had lost by such a large amount. I lost by 9 or 10 percentage points. And the problem was I wasn't collecting the gubernatorial results with my own. So I don't think anybody can swim against 40 percentage points. That's calling on people to really switch in such numbers. And I had told Lynch, election day, I said, look, if McGreevey can hold it to 25, I'll win. If he could have held it to 30, I would have won. But he couldn't. So I don't take it personally.
Okay. You joined the McGreevey's Department of Education as an Abbott, as the Abbott Division Director. Is that
First
correct?
and last, right.
First and last?
Right.
Why last?
Because they abolished it after I left.
Why?
I don't know. You'll have to talk to Lucille Davy or John Corzine or somebody in between.
Good experience? Frustrating
Oh, great.
experience?
No, very frustrating and great. I mean, it's
Very frustrating and great?
Absolutely. Very frustrating. If you think about it, this is the Maybe along with getting affordable health care in place for everybody. For the last 40 years, this has been the problem that has dogged the United States. It's the fact that you have a gap between what happens to poor kids and what happens to middle-class kids. And no one's been very successful at closing it. That's what Abbott was supposed to do by all the declarations of the court. As I indicated earlier, by putting all these other things in place, these very specific mandates, they deflected everybody's attention, that court did, deflected everybody's attention to whether the mandates were being implemented. Wrong question. Because most of the mandates have nothing to do with improving the quality of education for kids and getting results. So what this allowed me to do, and Bill Librera as the commissioner understood this, encouraged it, protected me every step along the way. The Black Caucus wanted me fired almost from the second year I was there. And both McGreevy and Librera protected me on this. And the reason they wanted me fired was that I said we're looking at the wrong thing. We need to look at whether kids learn to read. If they don't learn to read, they can't be educated. Does anybody argue with that? No, I've never had an argument about that. The second proposition was they need to learn to read early. If they don't learn to read by the time they're in third or fourth grade, the chances of their ever being able to read on grade level are de minimis, less than 10%. Won't happen. So we have two things that we know. Everybody accepts it. Let's do it. And let's stop worrying about everything else. That's basically what I tried to do. And I was confident in doing it because I had Union City as an example of what happens when you do it. It works. You can do it. And we had this huge advantage, which was preschool, starting at age 3. The quality of that preschool, if it's good, gets kids ready to read when they get to kindergarten. So I had the benefit of Ellen Freedy, who was in charge of early childhood education, and Fred Carrig, who I recruited from Union City. I don't know anything about this. I know what the problem is, but I don't know how to solve it. They know how to solve it. So what I did was to work with them, to help them do their job. And what we did, we made an offer. Instead of us telling you what to do, you work with us, we'll work with you, we'll try and figure out the problem in your district. Because it'll be different. Because what's gone on in New Jersey, as in the rest of the country, and which is totally ignored by the Supreme Court, by the way, is that between Abbott 1 and Abbott 19, Latinos have become the biggest minority in New Jersey, and overwhelmingly the biggest minority in the Abbott districts. What you've seen, therefore, is another problem that makes it more complicated. Not only are these kids poor, not only do they not speak English, but their parents don't read Spanish. So you have illiterate Spanish speakers coming in large numbers from the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Central America. Tough. Well, Plainfield, was 10% Latino when the first Abbott decision came down. Is now 45% Latino. But there are no Latinos on the city council. There's only one Latino on the school board. No Latinos in the administration. So who's putting the pressure on to solve this problem? And so you need to have people who understand that they need to get kids reading. If they accept that, and they accept that it's their obligation to do it, and they want to work with the department, we could show that it would work. And so in places like Orange, Perth Amboy, Vineland, Pleasantville, Elizabeth, Jersey City, we showed this could work. And that's very satisfying. And it was altogether frustrating. You'd have to deal with lawyers, bureaucrats, governor's office, the Asbury Park Press. You got all of these things you got to contend with. The Black Caucus, people don't like you. But it was great.
I think we should wrap on this. You've criticized the Supreme Court's most recent Abbott decision.
Mm-hmm.
What should state government do now?
Make a better argument before the Superior Court judge who's been remanded the case than they made before the Supreme Court
A better argument for the
their
new
for the funding formula. Yeah.
Why?
Why? Because they want.
Why is that the answer? The new funding formula.
Because it's a very sensible thing to do. It's because the changes that have taken place since 1980, when Abbott was first filed. Just think about it. I mean, it's 28 years ago. Hoboken. Now, if we had all invested in Hoboken in 1980, would we be a lot richer today? You bet we would. None of us can afford to live there now. But it was a different place in 1980. And the school district has been affected by this because the school district has dwindled. In the meantime, the property wealth in Hoboken is huge. Even the governor lives there. Now, why should anybody who lives in Carteret or Rahway or Hillside have their taxes go to pay for preschool or new facilities in Hoboken? Doesn't make sense. The same thing is going on to a lesser extent in Long Branch, in Jersey City, and so you have and other places that were put on this list, by the way, which was drawn up in 1977 for some urban aid program. So it wasn't even well thought out. So you've got districts where the free lunch rate is half of what it is in a lot of other places that don't get this. So this is a powerful argument that you need to address the needs of poor kids, not school districts. And if you do that, and if you screen that against the wealth, the financial capacity of the district, you've got a pretty good idea. That's what Corzine has done. It's a good idea.
We're wrapping up. Any last thoughts on the governorship or where education is in New Jersey or the state itself?
There's no. I think the state is bankrupt, don't you? I mean, that's a problem, and I think it's not just sort of bankrupt. I think it's technically bankrupt, and I think the actions of the last 3 years, the last 7 years, the last 15 years have brought that on and have served to deepen it. And it's not being treated with the urgency that's required when you're bankrupt. So I think it's a perilous time.